Auschwitz-Birkenau, a camp turned into a system. On April 30th, 1940, Rudolf Höss arrived in the town of Oswiecim in occupied Poland to take command of a new German camp called Auschwitz. At first, it was presented as a prison and a tool of terror, with roll calls, punishments, and routines designed to break people and extract labor. But Nazi policy escalated, and Auschwitz expanded into a complex, with Auschwitz I as the administrative center and Birkenau as the vast extension built to receive deportation trains. From 1942 onward, arrivals were processed with ruthless speed, families were separated, property was seized, and people were sorted for forced labor or immediate death. A grim side fact is how much of the operation looked ordinary on paper, with schedules, inventories, and construction plans, as if this were an industrial project. Survivors later described warehouses nicknamed Canada, where stolen suitcases and clothing were stored and redistributed, turning theft into a system. The complex also tied mass violence to industry. At Monowitz, prisoners were exploited near major industrial facilities, showing how profit and persecution could overlap. Even in such controlled conditions, people resisted in small ways by sharing information, preserving names, and leaving hidden messages. In October 1944, a revolt by prisoners forced to work near the killing facilities briefly disrupted the system and left evidence the perpetrators could not fully erase. When Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, the survivors and the remaining records made denial far harder. Nanjing, when a capital lost its protection. On December 13, 1937, Japanese forces entered Nanjing, then the capital of the Republic of China, during a campaign led by senior commanders including General Iwane Matsui, with Prince Yasuhiko Asaka among the high-ranking figures present. What followed over the next weeks was not just the confusion of a captured city. It became a sustained period in which civilians and captives were exposed to large-scale abuse, and the normal safeguards of war collapsed across neighborhoods, streets, and detention points. One reason the episode is so well documented is the work of foreign residents who stayed behind. An international committee organized the Nanjing Safety Zone, and people such as John Rabe tried to create pockets of protection by negotiating with officers and marking shelters. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, kept a detailed diary describing the strain of caring for desperate crowds day after day, while violence spread outside the safe areas. Their records were not written for propaganda. They were written to explain what they were seeing and to leave evidence. Historians continue to debate exact totals, and different institutions cite different estimates, but the core reality remains. The conquered population faced widespread killing, intimidation, and sexual coercion. After the war, tribunals in China and the International Military Tribunal for the Far East addressed the crimes, although legal outcomes and public memory were shaped by politics. Nanjing endures as a warning about what happens when an army stops treating a city's civilians as human beings with rights. Babyn Yar, a ravine outside Kiev. On September 29, 1941, SS and German police units began a mass killing at a ravine outside Kiev known as Babyn Yar, with officials such as Paul Blobel involved in directing operations. The plan relied on control and deception. Jewish residents were ordered to report with documents and belongings under language that suggested relocation, not danger. Families arrived carrying bags, and that last moment of ordinary hope was used against them as the crowd was driven toward the ravine and forced forward in tightly controlled groups. A chilling side fact is how carefully the crime was reported. German documentation for the two-day operation recorded approximately 33,771 victims, a number that is repeated because it exposes the bureaucracy behind mass murder. Babyn Yar was also part of a wider pattern on the Eastern Front, where mobile killing units and police formations carried out shootings near towns and cities, often close enough that local people could not truly pretend they did not know. The ravine did not stop being used after those 2 days. Other targeted groups were killed there later, turning the site into a repeated crime scene. Decades afterward, public remembrance was complicated by politics because Soviet-era language often avoided naming Jewish victims specifically and spoke instead in broader, vaguer terms. Survivor testimonies helped preserve the truth. Babyn Yar stands for a hard reality. The Holocaust was not only camps, it was also open-air mass murder near everyday life. Unit 731. War Through Research. In 1936, Japanese Army physician Shiro Ishii expanded a secret program known as Unit 731, centered near Harbin in occupied Manchuria, with a major facility in the Pingfang area. Official descriptions use technical language about epidemic prevention and water purification, but the program's true purpose was to explore biological warfare and military advantage through experiments carried out on human beings. Victims, often civilians and prisoners from occupied territories, were treated as disposable sources of data. A useful side fact is how the unit blended laboratory routine with military discipline. It used code names, restricted zones, and an internal paperwork culture that made cruelty feel like procedure. Historians also connect Unit 731 and related units to the development of pathogens intended for warfare and to incidents in which diseases were spread in parts of China, expanding harm beyond the walls of the facility. As Japan's defeat became likely, the unit destroyed evidence and tried to erase trails. The post-war story adds another layer. Some personnel faced prosecution in Soviet proceedings, while other accountability paths were uneven, and scholars have written about how post-war intelligence interests shaped what information was collected and how some individuals were treated. The documentary lesson is that war crimes are not always committed in moments of chaos. Sometimes they are built inside institutions that look organized and scientific, and that appearance can delay accountability. Lidice, a village chosen for fear. On the night of June 9, 1942, German forces surrounded the Czech village of Lidice after Adolf Hitler's regime ordered reprisals following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, who had been attacked on May 27 and died on June 4. The choice of Lidice was not based on a careful legal process. It was collective punishment designed to frighten a broader population into submission, a message aimed at every community that might quietly support resistance. Men were separated from women and children, then many were killed, while women were deported and children were taken away, with only a small number selected for forced assimilation. Then the village itself was erased, houses were burned, ruins were flattened, and even the cemetery was disturbed, as if the landscape could be forced to deny that the community had existed. A related side fact is that Lidice was not the only place targeted in this way. The village of Leziki was also destroyed soon after, showing that reprisal policy could be repeated, not just performed once for shock. What the Nazis wanted was fear, but what they also created was international symbolism. During the war, the name Lidice spread across newspapers and radio broadcasts, and people in several countries named streets, schools, and even newborn children after the village, as a way of refusing the attempt to delete it. Lidice matters because it shows how war crimes can be used as messaging. The crime was not only the killings and deportations, but the intention to teach entire populations that innocence would not protect them. The comfort stations, a system built on coercion. From the late 1930s through 1945, the Japanese military expanded a network of so-called comfort stations, a euphemism that hid coercion behind administrative language. Women and girls from multiple regions of the empire and occupied territories were recruited through deception, pressure, and sometimes direct force, then transported to locations where their movement was controlled and their choices were effectively removed. Many were compelled to provide sexual services for soldiers under conditions where consent was not possible. A key point for a documentary audience is that this was not an accidental side effect of war. The system relied on occupation structures, local brokers, transport, and a chain of authority that made it stable and repeatable. Records and testimony indicate that victims came from Korea, China, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and other places, and that the system followed the expansion of the Japanese military footprint. Survivors have described not only physical harm, but the long shadow of isolation, fear, and stigma that continued long after the war ended. Post-war politics made the subject difficult. Many survivors returned to communities that did not want to hear the story, and governments often prioritized rebuilding and alliances over deep accountability. In the 1990s, survivors' public testimony and international legal analysis helped reframe the system as military sexual slavery rather than regulated prostitution. The lasting lesson is about language. Euphemisms can make a crime easier to ignore, and they can delay recognition, but they do not change what the victims endured. Wola, Warsaw's district of no mercy. On August 5, 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising that had begun on August 1st, German forces escalated their response in the Wola district, following orders shaped by the intent to crush the city through terror. Units associated with commanders such as Heinz Reineffarth and Oskar Derlewanger became linked to mass killings that targeted civilians rather than focusing only on armed resistance. Over several days, residents were pulled from homes, courtyards, and shelters, and many were killed in large groups, including people in hospitals and aid sites that should have been protected. One disturbing side fact is the speed. In a short span, the district became a place where entire streets could be emptied, and the message was meant to be understood by everyone still hiding in the city. Resistance would bring annihilation. Historians often describe Wola as one of the largest single episodes of civilian massacre in occupied Europe during the war, and its scale helps explain why Warsaw's trauma is not only about combat, but about deliberate punishment. The story also contains a cold shift in logic. As the days passed, Some German commands reportedly adjusted tactics, not out of mercy, but because killing everyone eliminated potential forced labor. That detail underlines the cruelty of the policy itself. After the war, accountability was uneven. Some participants faced prosecution, while others avoided serious consequences for years. Wola matters because it shows how quickly a security operation can become mass violence when leadership decides that civilians are not protected. Bataan, when surrender did not mean safety. On April 9, 1942, after months of fighting and severe shortages, American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula surrendered to Japan, with General Masaharu Homma commanding the broader campaign. Under the laws of war, surrender should begin a protected status for prisoners of war, including access to water, medical care, and humane treatment. Instead, what followed became the Bataan Death March, a forced movement that pushed exhausted captives along long routes toward detention sites. A small but telling fact is how the march unfolded in stages. Prisoners were driven toward San Fernando, then packed into rail transport under miserable conditions, and later forced onward toward camps such as Camp O'Donnell. Heat, thirst, illness, and violence combined into a moving disaster. Survivors later described the experience not as one dramatic scene, but as hours and days in which hope repeatedly collapsed, and where the rules of custody seemed to disappear. Estimates of the death toll vary, but the event became a defining symbol in the Pacific War. The post-war legal outcome mattered. Homma was tried by a United States military commission and convicted, and the proceedings became part of the wider development of command responsibility. The idea is simple but essential. Commanders cannot hide behind distance when their forces commit predictable crimes on a massive scale. In documentary storytelling, Bataan explains why prisoner treatment is not a minor footnote. It is a moral test, and when surrender stops meaning safety, war becomes something else. Katyn, a crime followed by denial. On March 5, 1940, Soviet Security Chief Lavrenti Beria proposed to Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Politburo that thousands of Polish officers and members of Poland's educated leadership held in Soviet custody should be executed, and the decision was approved at the highest level. In the weeks that followed, the NKVD carried out mass killings at multiple sites. Victims included prisoners taken from camps such as Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, and graves were later linked to locations such as the Katyn forest near Smolensk, burial sites near Kalinin, now Tver, and burial sites near Kharkiv. The crime did not end with the killings. During the war, in 1943, German forces announced the discovery of mass graves, and the truth became a propaganda battlefield. Nazi Germany used the discovery to attack the Soviet Union, while the Soviet Union blamed Germany, and maintained that narrative for decades. For families, that meant a second cruelty. Not only loss, but enforced uncertainty, and sometimes punishment for insisting on the truth. Allied governments, focused on defeating Nazi Germany, were cautious about a public break with the Soviet Union, which helped the false narrative persist. Only much later did official acknowledgement become possible. In 1990, Soviet authorities recognized NKVD responsibility, and later document releases clarified how high-level the decision had been. Katyn is a documentary lesson about how denial becomes part of the crime. When a state controls information, it can prolong suffering by turning mourning into argument, and it can try to rewrite history itself. Malmedy, a crossroads where rules failed. On December 17, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, elements of a German armored formation known as Kampfgruppe Piper captured American soldiers near the Baugnier crossroads, not far from the town of Malmedy in Belgium. The prisoners had surrendered, and under the laws of war, that moment should have marked a transition from combat to custody. Instead, more than 80 American prisoners were killed, and a small number survived by escaping, hiding, or by being left for dead. Those survivors later described confusion, sudden gunfire, and desperate attempts to get away, and their testimony became central to what investigators could prove. The setting is part of why the case became so widely known. This was not a distant camp hidden behind barbed wire. It was a winter battlefield crossroads, the kind of place where rules are supposed to matter precisely because confusion and fear are everywhere. The recovery of bodies and the survivors' accounts helped reconstruct the sequence, and they prevented the crime from being lost in the noise of a huge offensive. After the war, the killings were prosecuted in United States military proceedings held at Dachau, alongside other cases involving German crimes. The Malmedy trial later became controversial in parts of public debate, with arguments over interrogation methods, evidence handling, and later sentence commutations, and those disputes sometimes distracted from the underlying facts. Even with that history, the moral point remains straightforward. The killing of surrendered prisoners is a clear violation of the laws of war, And Malmedy remains a benchmark case in post-war accountability. These 10 cases are not a full list, but they show how atrocity grows when people are stripped of protection. Denial can become a second crime. Trials did not heal loss, but set a line. Remembering means noticing signs early.